Our ancient ancestors were resourceful, inventive people. We know that because we've found plenty of their inventions. They were actually so resourceful and inventive that we struggle to understand some of the technology that they developed. And you're going to see it in this video. Italian Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci has a strong claim to having the greatest mind in human history. The polymath was light years ahead of his time in art, science, biology, and sculpting, and it appears that he could predict the future of military combat too. Long before a tank ever rolled across the fields of Europe, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, Da Vinci had come up with a basic idea of what they might look like. He never built a prototype based on his design, but the fundamental principles of it are sound. The Da Vinci tank had space for outward-facing blunderbusses and a removable top section that could be opened to aid the vision of the driver. The wheels were probably too thin to be of any use in a muddy field, and the crank design of the axle looks faulty, but we shouldn't hold that against him. A wooden tank probably wouldn't have lasted long on the battlefield, but this design is a basic blueprint for the future. In fact, a group of engineers was able to successfully build a working model of the tank based on Da Vinci's blueprints in 2010. In many ways, the point of archaeology is to bring the past to life. Here's a facility in Pompeii that makes that process literal. It's an ancient fast food counter called a Thermopolium, and in December 2020, it reopened to the public for the first time since the day Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the city in the year 79. The Thermopolium, complete with its beautiful frescoes, can be thought of as the ancient Roman equivalent of a fast food restaurant. The vendor who owned or worked in it would cook food at home and then bring it here to be reheated and sold to order, often accompanied by red wine. If we accept that the paintings on the exterior walls of the structure reflect the items on the menu, then we can say that the Thermopolium sold mostly chicken and duck. Some sealed jars were found inside the Thermopolium when it was discovered in 2019 though, and analysis of the contents revealed traces of snails, fish, pork, and beef. Whoever owned this stall must have believed in the idea of having something for everyone. The modern-day Thermopolium won't be quite so eclectic and will also have to adhere to modern health and safety standards, but it's as close to eating an old Pompeii as anyone's ever going to get. Knowing in advance whether there was a famine or flood coming to the Egyptian capital of Cairo could make the difference between life and death for thousands of the city's residents. The people of the time didn't have access to satellite imaging or knowledge of meteorology, but they did have a type of well, known as a Nileometer. This fantastic cathedral-like structure still exists in Cairo today, and could still serve its original purpose if anybody ever needed it to. It's one of 3 Nileometers that still exist here, but it's by far the grandest. With an octagonal marble column running through its center, surrounded by a staircase so priests could get to the bottom of the well and back down again. It's thought that the Nileometer was introduced to Cairo about 5,000 years ago. By descending to the bottom of the well at specific times of the year and noting the position of the Nile's water level on the marble column, priests could deduce whether the waters were too high, too low, or just about right. That information would then be relayed to the city's leaders and eventually to the pharaoh. Only priests and leaders were allowed access to the Nileometer. Presumably, such knowledge was considered to be privileged information. The ancient occupants of China not only invented the concept of a compass, but also reinvented the compass many times over. They came up with a version of a compass that looks like a fish, another compass that looks like a spoon, and then this odd device. It's known as the south-pointing chariot, because the outstretched arm of the figure atop it always points due south. South-pointing chariots were considered an essential piece of kit for travelers in China for a very long time. Evidence suggests that they were invented during the 3rd century and remained in regular use until the 13th. Unlike most compasses, The south-pointing chariot doesn't contain a magnet. Instead, it relies on its owner to manually set the arm to due south before they begin their journeys. The complex mechanisms within the device would then ensure that the arm continues to point south no matter how many twists and turns the owner might take on their travels. This basic function, when used in conjunction with the primitive maps of the time, would give people a fighting chance of not getting lost when crossing large distances. There are many myths attached to Volel paper machines. They're said to be able to calculate the date and time, which seems reasonable. But would you believe that they could also calculate the concept of absolute truth? The man who invented them certainly wanted people to think so. That man was Ramon Lull of Majorca, one of the most respected scientists and philosophers in Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries. In design and function, they're a little like astrolabes, but astrolabes were clockwork and made of steel. Making a functional machine like this out of paper is astonishing. Aside from being a philosopher, Lull also saw himself as a religious visionary and argued that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism should all be united as one faith, worshipping one God. To use his Volels, the user had to align the machine with the pole star and center the crossed circles on the face of the Volel. Using this method, it was apparently possible to determine your location, the time, and the date. At the same time, the newly orientated Volel would also display a compelling argument for the existence of God. It's a very strange creation, and it isn't surprising that 300 years later, they were banned because people thought they were being used in dark arts rituals. If you found yourself struck down by the bubonic plague during the 1600s, you'd have found yourself calling on the services of the plague doctor. With their dark robes and grotesque masks, they look like something out of a horror movie, but they were there to try to save your life, often with little success. Successful doctors didn't want to lay their own hands on victims of the plague because they were afraid of being infected. So the men behind the masks were often young medical students, or people with no medical training at all. History records at least one case of a fruit and vegetable salesman who doubled up as a plague doctor. Their masks were stuffed with fruit and spices because they believed the pleasant aromas would prevent them from catching the plague from their patients. They were wrong, but it didn't stop them from going about their trade for around 200 years, until the practice died out during the 1800s. A very well-preserved example of a plague doctor's mask can be found inside the German Museum of Medical History and is thought to date back to the 14th century. It's amazing that masks like these were the best defense we had against infection for over 400 years. Our next artifact has several names, but precisely 0 credible explanations of its origin or purpose. It's the Disc of Sabu, also sometimes known as the Schist Disc or the Saqqara Disc. The latter name is a clue that it was discovered in Saqqara, Egypt. The best guess of archaeologists is that the 5,000-year-old artifact is a highly elaborate candlestick holder. If that's the case, it's the only one of its kind we've ever found. The fact that it's obsidian suggests there's more to it than a simple candlestick holder. Obsidian is a notoriously difficult material to work with, and nobody would go to the trouble of making a candlestick holder out of it back then when other materials were available. Even the fact that it's shaped like a wheel is a puzzle, because as far as we're aware, the Egyptians were yet to discover the wheel 5,000 years ago. Conspiracy theorists on the internet will try to tell you that this is the steering wheel of an alien spaceship. We're not about to believe that, but the candlestick explanation is wholly unsatisfying. Our next artifact is quite a strange one, and, if you're British, quite a rude one. It's what's known colloquially as a Bollock Dagger, and it was found close to a 13th century cathedral in Belgium in March 2022. Ypres Cathedral was badly damaged during the Second World War, and while the cathedral itself has been repaired, much of the land around it hasn't. It's that bombed-out land that archaeologists are exploring at the moment, and the Bollock Dagger is easily one of the most interesting things they've found so far. The basic idea of a Bollock Dagger is that it could be tied around the waist and used as a second weapon if a primary weapon, like a full-sized sword, was dropped during combat. There are a few theories as to how it got its memorable name. The first is that the two spheres on the weapon's handle look like testes. The second is that when it was worn around the waist, the blade would often hang near the testes. As any British person watching this video will know, the most common term for testes in the British Isles is bollocks. A third theory is that the weapon is so named because of the part of the body it was intended to stab, but let's not get into that. We all know what a Swiss Army knife looks like, and it doesn't look like this. But this might have been the equivalent of a Swiss Army knife 65,000 years ago. This stone tool is one of many similar tools that were found in the south of Africa in mid-2022. It's not only typical of South Africa, though. You'll find ancient tools that look like this in museums all over the world. To many historians and scholars, the similarities between the tools are significant. It's apparent just from looking at them that they were all made according to the same template, even in cases where the tools were made and found thousands of miles apart. That indicates that the design for the tool traveled thousands of miles, crossing borders and even seas as it did so. There is no suggestion that the people who lived in Africa 65,000 years ago transmitted the template in person. Instead, it's likely they explained it to someone, who explained it to someone else, who explained it to someone else, and so on. If you look at it that way, it's evidence of a social network existing across the Earth during prehistory. Lots of people enjoy olive oil, but it's possible that nobody has ever enjoyed olive oil as much as the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians. In 2022, Dr. Emlyn Dodd attempted to recreate the original method of ancient Egyptian oil pressing, using something called the torsion method. Historians believe that it was first used in Egypt around 4,500 years ago, but it's thought that the Egyptians learned it from the ancient inhabitants of Crete, who invented it around 10,000 years ago. Aside from being used in food, it was used for washing. Pliny the Elder believed that nobody could ever be truly clean if they didn't wash in olive oil. Returning to Dr. Dodd, he first crushed his olives with a basic mortar and pestle, then placed them in a permeable cheesecloth bag. After attaching sticks to each end of the bag, he twisted them in opposite directions to extract the oil from within his olives. It's thought that the Egyptians actually used this method to produce olive oil for wine, but Dr. Dodd says the batch he produced tasted more like extra virgin oil, with a flavor he described as bitey. We've already looked at Leonardo da Vinci's design for a tank, but he also designed many other weapons. One of them is a giant crossbow called, originally enough, Leonardo's crossbow. If you remember the giant scorpion crossbows from Game of Thrones, you'll find this design very similar. The genius never actually built such a device, but he included a design for one in his Codex Atlanticus. It's thought that Da Vinci was asked to consider the matter by Ludovico Sforza, who wanted a new weapon to solidify his territory in and around Milan, Italy. It seemed that Da Vinci sketched his first design for the weapon in 1483, but then added to and amended the idea several times over the next decade. In 2003, a working model of the giant crossbow was finally built for a documentary series called Leonardo's Dream Machines, which was aired in the United Kingdom on Channel 4. The design was found to be viable, and so the weapon would have been a major breakthrough in the 15th century had anyone actually taken Da Vinci up on his design and actually built one. There are plenty of scientists who believe that the PES Canoe is the oldest boat in the world. It's certainly the world's oldest canoe. Carbon dating tests indicate that this canoe was hollowed out and used during the early Mesolithic era, somewhere between the years 8040 and 7510 BCE. That means the canoe could be more than 10,000 years old. You'll find the PES Canoe in the Drents Museum of Assen, Netherlands today, but it was found during the construction of the Dutch A28 motorway in 1955, not far from the village of Pessa, hence the artifact's name. Wooden artifacts don't usually survive for 10,000 years, but this one has been preserved because it's become trapped in a peat bog. There was once some speculation about whether the canoe would have been seaworthy, but that debate ended in 2001 when archaeologist Jaap Bukker created an exact replica and paddled it down a river. From marks left on the surface of the canoe, which is made from a Scots pine log, indicate that the tools used to hollow it out were made of flint and antler. We don't know the name of the culture that created it, and probably never will.
Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!